What's up, everyone? Welcome to Bill Bronze and Dragons. I'm your host, Bill Bron Bafflestone. So I've been working on a monk build to present to all of you guys, and I'm very excited about it. It's a pretty awesome build, I think, and it's not a simple build. Simple builds, I think, have their place when I'm doing concept builds, like my Jiraiya build from a few months back. But this is going to be one of those patented Bill Bronze builds where I go over every ability and every decision that I made between alternatives and go over all of the cool combos and really into, quite a bit of depth about all of the things that you can do. And I'll be tracking the progression of our damage and our AC and our saves and our abilities and all of that. Very cool build. I'll be putting that out here a few days after this video. But in so doing, I had the question of, do I want to do DPR calculations for this? And I decided against it, and I had a little blurb in the setup comments about it in the build, but then one of the guys in my Patreon Discord, Mandrax Corto, said, hey, that's actually a pretty interesting thing that you should talk about more instead of this quick blurb. You should split that out into a whole new video and talk about that in depth, and then you don't have to worry about it in the monk video. I was like, that is a darn good idea, Mando. I think I'm going to do it. And so that's why I'm doing this video here today, talking about why I'm not going to do DPR calculations in my build for the monk and going forward. Now, I should first say, the fact that I'm not doing DPR calculations does not mean that I'm not going to be doing any math. You still need to do math in a build when you are trying to make choices in the face of opportunity costs, right? And so I actually had an issue with this in my monk build, where I'm going to be using a bonus action to do something that I think adds to the build's abilities, but I wasn't sure, had to check, and it actually turns out to be kind of complicated, where you're always going to want to use this thing levels 1 through 5, and then you're usually going to want to do this thing levels 6 through 11, and then after level 12 you're probably going to start featuring something else and keeping this other thing in the back pocket for the certain scenarios in which it still adds value, right? So it got a little complicated. We had to do math, but that is not the same as DPR calculations. They're much simpler, and DPR calculations are not. Now, I have 3 issues with DPR calculations. 1, DPR calculations require assumptions, right? There's a whole bunch of assumptions that go into figuring out DPR, and if you're not using a consistent set of assumptions, then it's just kind of like comparing apples to oranges. And if you look at different optimizers, they all have wildly different sets of assumptions. Some optimizers have really complicated assumptions where it's like, okay, we're going to do 4 battles a day, and we're going to get 2 short rests a day, and I'm going to be using like half of my resources for damage, and right, they're thinking of all of these different variables and trying to plug them in, and accounting for every bonus action, and I'm going to use my reaction for damage, like 1 out of every 4 rounds, and yada yada. And then other optimizers are looking at like the most damage they can do in 1 round and say, all right, well, that's my DPR, ignoring the fact that it took like 2 rounds of buffing to get to that number. And that's not saying that either approach or any approach is wrong. It's just you kind of have to dig deep into the assumptions in order to know what the hell those numbers mean. And that's a pretty detailed and work-filled operation that you can't really expect viewers to go through. And so I didn't want to deal with it because assumptions are, no matter how complex they are, they're not really reflective of how the game actually plays out, right? There's a lot of nuance to these things, right? You have to make mathematical assumptions, right? We tend to calculate mean values over a large number of iterations, but that discounts variability. For example, 2d6 plus 4 is mathematically equivalent to 1d6 plus 2 times 2, But in practice, having multiple attacks is better, right? You can spread the damage around. You know, if you've got one enemy on one hit point, you don't have to use your one hit with big damage to kill that enemy. You would have an extra attack to, you know, spread the damage around. And having more attacks increases the value of certain buffs that you get, right? So those are things that are not captured in DPR calculations, but they matter a lot when we're talking about what we're actually doing on the field. There are build assumptions. Usually we do this white room DPR calculation without taking into account the fact that a character has items, right? Magic items make a big difference. They have average wealth, right? They don't have any consumables. And so, you know, someone who gets Awakened Dragon's Wrath weapon early in their career is going to be wrecking people with huge damage. And someone at another table who at level 17 just got their first +1 weapon is not going to be wrecking people to a certain degree, or, you know, as much. So, you know, all of that makes a big difference in terms of DPR calculations. There are engagement assumptions, right? How many battles are you going to have in a day? How many short rests do you get in a day, right? The pace of combat varies wildly from table to table, and even within tables at different times. You know, sometimes you have a lot of downtime, sometimes you're just doing an adventure a day, sometimes you're on this long slog of a war campaign, and, you know, short rests and long rests are difficult to come by. All of that makes a big difference. So there are also a lot of situational assumptions, right? The PC is alive and capable of making attacks, right? Their defense is held up. The PC is uncontrolled, right? They have an action, right? Their saves or what have you held up, immunities and resistances and such. The PC is positioned to make attacks, right? It's not that the PC or the enemy is super far away and the character has to, you know, use the dash action or a bonus action to Misty Step or something. They're right there, just hammering away at an infinite hit point sponge. But that's not how the game plays out, right? So there's just so many assumptions involved in making DPR calculations that it's hard to say how much meaning they have in terms of how we actually play this game. Now, the second reason that I don't really want to spend a lot of time on DPR calculations is that they don't ultimately seem to make that much difference. So Treant Monk, who is, you know, like the king of the optimizers, if you're watching my channel, I'm sure you know who Treant Monk is, did a really great series analyzing the damage or DPR for all of these different classes. And he uses a very good set of assumptions, I think, very complex, and, you know, he figures out all of the long rests and how many, or all of the battles per day and, you know, short rests and all that, very deep and complex assumptions. And basically what he found is that all the classes do about the same damage, right? There's a curve, and, you know, some are a little above, some are a little below. There are outliers like Conjure Minor Elementals, but most of the time the game is just designed in a way where everybody does around the same DPR. So, you know, why should I go through all the, you know, trouble of calculating these things when it's really not going to make much difference anyway? And honestly, my experience in creating builds is that even though I don't worry about damage or DPR calculations until the very end, after I've made all of my decisions, right? None of my decisions were influenced by trying to increase DPR. It always turns out that they have superior DPR anyway, right? So as long as you do even a moderate bit of optimization, the DPR is going to be fine. Now, the third and final reason that I don't really like DPR calculations is that they, no matter how complex, don't really capture the nuances of a multivariable analysis when it comes to builds, right? It's just like one metric, and there are a whole lot of other stuff that matters too, you know, AoE output, and crowd control output, and defenses, and your maneuverability, and your senses, right? All of these things combine to create a holistic picture of effectiveness. And, focusing on DPR just, it's a little bit simplistic. Now, I get it. It's human nature to kind of gravitate towards these simple single metrics. And to this end, I always remember right when I graduated college with my economics degree, I started working at this top management and strategy consulting firm. And every year they had a recruiting process and would get a bajillion applications from all of these top schools. And the way that they did it was like, okay, the people that went to Harvard, you're going to look at the Harvard applications. The people that went to Princeton, you're going to look at the Princeton applications. The people from Columbia, you're going to look at the Columbia applications. And so I went to Columbia, and so I would look at these, applications from students from Columbia who wanted to come work for us. And when I went into it, I was like, all right, I'm going to be really holistic here. I'm not going to just look at GPA and stuff like that. I'm going to, look at all of their accomplishments and the things that they've been doing. And I'm going to try and find really cool, well-rounded people to bring into the company. But then I found I had like 300 or 400 resumes to go through, and you can't just put that much care and attention into so many, right? I'm also trying to work for a living here. And so it got so complicated that finally I found myself just starting to look at the GPA, right? It's, just human nature. I get it. But the fact is that there's just so much more that goes into a good PC than the DPR output. When I do a build, I try and evaluate the build holistically. I certainly look at the damage output, but not in terms of DPR. I look at the amount of damage they do per attack and the number of attacks they do per round. That's going to give us a sense of how much damage we're doing without actually going through the process of calculating DPR. I like to take into account a build's crowd control capabilities. Right? Do they have spells available? Are they specialists in grappling and shoving? Do they have weapon masteries like Topple or Vex? Do they have class features that make it so that they attack all of their allies at disadvantage? Right? All of these things play into a build's effectiveness, but it doesn't necessarily show up in the DPR numbers. Right? What are their defenses like? Are they going to survive to do damage? Right? Do they have a high AC so they can stand in? Or do they have a good kiting ability so they can stay out of danger? Are their saves good so that they don't get stunned or paralyzed or charmed or what have you? Do they have immunity to charm or resistances to damage? The defenses matter quite a bit. And as you're probably aware, I'm a defensive-minded player. So I always try to make sure that my builds have good, strong defenses. The maneuverability of a PC matters tremendously. Do they have an insane move speed? Do they have a fly speed? Can they teleport out of a grapple or a wall of force? Those things matter quite frequently in building a PC, right? But not reflected in DPR. That's why people say monks are bad, right? Monks, in 2014 at least, didn't have amazing damage output. And the fact that they could move, 60 feet around or 120 feet around with a bonus action, kind of fell by the wayside. I like to look at feature synergy, right? I love creating combos between, different class abilities or feats or items that work together and create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. Finally, I like to look at a build's fun factor. Right? We got to play this build. Right? We're not about just cranking out the best numbers. We want to have like a cool concept and a cool build, and maybe something that's a little different from what everybody else is going to be bringing, but still works with other classes really well. So yeah, there's just so much that goes into evaluating a build that I just decided not to deal with DPR and have this single metric by which people are going to evaluate the build. And I know it makes things a lot harder. You're going to have to watch like the whole 40-minute video or whatever for my monk here in a few days in order to get a full sense of what the build is able to do, but that's how we like to roll here at Build Runs and Dragons. So yeah, that's why I'm done with DPR calculations. Let me know what you think in the comments. I am curious to know what everybody's thoughts are about DPR, And regardless, thank you so much for watching. This has been Build Bronze and Dragons. I'm your host, Build Bron Bafflestone. See you next time.